Good afternoon. Today I'll be speaking to Peter Ryan, who's in sunny California. Peter is a researcher in economics, history and technology. He holds a degree from New York University he's recently completed an MA in UCD. Some of his work has been cited by The Economist, The New York Times and by The Wall Street Journal. His dissertation has focused on the intersection between the Irish Revolution and the efforts of the nascent Irish state to set itself up financially through Dáil loans mainly. I'd like to start by asking Pete to maybe elucidate a bit on his dissertation and particularly on the hesitation which people like Harry Boland and Joseph Conley had, who were the Dáil representatives in New York, about taking a financial loan from American financiers.
All right, thanks for having me. I wrote a dissertation this past year for University College Dublin regarding the subjects that you just touched upon. It's titled Irish Anti-Imperialist and Nationalist Economics. And it really concerns this specific episode that occurred throughout the revolution and approximately at the end when the treaty was being signed in that transitionary phase that concerned a critical issue of finance and should the Irish revolutionaries engage in institutional financial markets centered on Wall Street to support the revolution. And while that was an original goal that was sidetracked for legal reasons initially, by 1921, the revolutionaries, best expressed through Harry Boland and Joseph Conley that were in New York, decided that they should reject that type of financial investment, not on the prior kind of legal constraints, but on a very ideological basis and in very flagrant language, calling that type of Wall Street capital evil and that it would be a imperialist force that would enter Ireland that would be a omen for nothing good. And so on learning about the initial inklings of this episode, it just stoked my curiosity and I had to learn more.
I've done some research on this area myself. I think one of the key problems which led obviously to the Dáil emissaries seeking finance abroad was the fact that a lot of people in Ireland were quite wealthy, but the problem was that most of the money that was in the bank was being invested abroad through the English Stock Exchange. So there wasn't actually an awful lot of money that was being invested in economic and particularly in industrial development here. And the Dáil government, the revolutionary government, were they conscious of that?
Yes, they were very conscious of that. The banking establishment within Ireland at the time of the revolution was very much not in favor of what was going on. They were very conservative. They were very conducive to the status quo in terms of their ideological predilections and what was good for their pocketbook. So there was at no time a real force of support for the revolutionaries from the banking establishment. And you can find the best expressed theories and explanations of what was going on in that respect from Arthur Griffith, one of the premier Irish revolutionaries. And while I touch upon a few different individuals, I always come back to him within my writing as always this primary source, is this original conceptualizer of a lot of the economic trends that were going on. And he was writing for years at that time on the nature of how investment was not being done in Ireland, not because the Irish weren't saving or because there was no opportunity to invest in Irish business, but because of a purely subjective decision for the banking establishment to send money abroad to Britain to invest in their industrial growth.
Yeah, I remember seeing one figure, I think it's from around the time of the early 1920s, and the amount of money that was being invested abroad from Irish banks was actually greater than the figure for GNP. And there just seemed to be absolutely no interest. And yet, for some strange reason, when the state was set up, that the people that Cosgrave Griffith unfortunately had died by the stage the state was properly set up, that they went to people like Andrew Jemison, who's the big distiller, and the people who ran the Irish banks, who were basically unionists, and asked them how do you think we should set up the state? So obviously they came back and they told them in the Banking Commission 1924 that they shouldn't pursue protectionism, and also that they shouldn't pursue any sort of policies that would be designed to force the banks to invest in the country.
So this was an interesting period immediately after the revolution, with the emergence of the Civil War, of the conservative 1920s. There seems to be a surface level clouding of the real history that went on there. And what actually happened that I feel that, as an American, but one that is appreciating Irish history and those within Ireland as well, that the sort of real deviation from what the economics of the revolution were very obvious, and they were very obvious at the time. And so instead of following the doctrines that, again, Griffith really was the best articulator of, the conservatives took a path which can be, to give the benefit of the doubt, understandable. With the Civil War going on, there was a intensity to just stand still. Like, we can't collapse. We just have to sort of keep going no matter what. And so there was a reluctance to try anything that could be considered radical. During the same period of time, you had economic problems going on in Germany, in Poland, in Russia. You can go all around Europe and find these episodes of specific monetary inflationary events. And you can give some sympathy to those figures within that government at the time, that attempting radical reform in the midst of a civil war and its aftermath, with all these examples around Europe, it would seem maybe not the best time to do it. With that being said, I think there is real blame to be found in that deviation, still going from what the original revolutionaries really thought and the leading figures of that time. The other key aspect of is the Civil War obviously drained a lot of hardliners to the revolutionary ideas out of that conservative government.
Yeah, I suppose on the one hand, it is understandable that their priority was to stabilise the state. They just fought a civil war and they were trying to establish themselves in power. But also, have you come across any suggestion that there were kind of protocols attached to the treaty? The part of it was setting up the Senate to ensure that there was going to be substantial unionist influence. Was there any clauses within anything you've seen that made it incumbent on the new state not to, say, break with sterling, or not to do anything to stop Irish banks investing through the London Stock Exchange?
There was nothing within the treaty or in the surrounding documents and literature and conversations that were being had at the time that would suggest there were explicit and firm prohibitions on radical economic reform under this new Irish Free State. I would say that when looking at Griffith and looking at Collins and looking at some of these leading figures that led the way on the treaty, there is nothing within their ideation of it that would be construed as turning away from more of the radical economics. What was occurring there, as far as Griffith was concerned, as sort of this enigma within revolutionary thought of, is he conservative? Is he really a revolutionary? His main goal was always to establish this autonomy, a degree within the political realm, but ultimately to achieve economic freedom. And so with him leading the way, the explicit characteristics of the treaty that would go on to cause a civil war were never really ones of economic concern. They were more symbolic and political. But within the economic sphere and the politics that would be attached to that, there was always a lot of freedom and wiggle room to create an independent structure that would be able to implement non-liberal, non-English liberal economic ideas that would benefit the industrial growth of Ireland.
Yeah, I think if you look at some of the historiography of that period, you kind of get a dichotomy between, on the one hand, the choice was either go along with the English economic system, or on the other hand, left Republicans would argue that there should have been some form of socialism, which neglects the fact that there's a huge body of nationalist economics that actually predated Grift, went back to Thomas Davis, who in the 1840s was writing about that the alternative landlordism wasn't nationalising the land, but it was redistributing it and creating small farms. And he also argued, even in relation to the factory system, that Ireland didn't necessarily have to copy the English the industrial model, that you could have smaller workshops and something akin to what later became distributism. That seemed to be completely lost.
Yes, absolutely. I think so much of that prehistory is lost on modern generations of understanding what the revolutionaries were fighting for. I think while Griffith was this kind of bottleneck of economic thought that then exploded during the revolutionary ideation, he was really pulling from, I would say, two distinct strands of thought, which was Catholic social teaching, and at the time, as you say, distributism and other encyclicals that would go on to opine about these matters, as well as, you could say, nationalist economics in the vein of the German 19th century economist Friedrich List, who is probably most well known for his advocacy of tariffs, of protectionism, of self-sufficiency, and of industry. So these were the two forces that were coming together to create the economics that Griffith articulated, and he most famously articulated this in his newspapers and speeches, and it became fully kind of cataloged within his third edition in 1918 of The Resurrection of Hungary, even though most concentrate on the joint monarchy ideas within the first half. Within the appendix, he has a lengthy collection of just going through all these economic ideas, what the policies would be for a future free Ireland, and actually citing all these sources like Frederick List, and also, interestingly, two Irish-American economists from the 19th century, Matthew and Henry Carey as well.
Yeah, and it's obvious from your dissertation that Collins tacitly at least agreed with Boland and Connolly in relation to the not taking the loan. Do you think, it's the great urban myth of Irish history, obviously, had Collins lived, had he not been killed, would he have made a difference? Think, would he have pursued a more radical economic course?
Yeah, I think what is often lost about Collins is that he's very much treated in a static way, where he was a young man, and coming through his radicalization while he was in London at the time, working within the financial industry of all things. Going to nationalist-oriented events and organizations, coming back to Ireland, getting more and more involved, going through the 1916 period, going through prison, getting more and more into the leadership cadre of the rebels. He was going through his 20s, and he was only arising to sort of this almost mythical status by the end of the revolution, and as the heir apparent after Griffith was sort of becoming more ill. Throughout that whole time, he was figuring out what his ideas were exactly. There is evidence that he was very much influenced by the ideas of James Connolly, the famous socialist revolutionary, and that there was some appreciation for some of those ideas. But as we explore further literature and evidence surrounding how he matured and his relationship specifically with Arthur Griffith, we start to see that he comes around to the ideas of Griffith more, and that in one of his few written published works and his final work, A Path for Freedom, which he wrote in 1922, he goes through a lot of these ideas expressing how Ireland's going to achieve independence in the economic realm after they gain that political independence from the treaty. And so when you actually look at that, you see that there's echoes from everything Arthur Griffith said. There's echoes in everything Arthur Griffith said to a lot of what he cited from Frederick List. And so when we combine all these doctrines together, we can see a very clear, very specific, and very sophisticated economic policy doctrine that would advocate for nationalized finance, that would advocate for finance directed at industrial growth, and that industrial growth aimed at expanding the advancement of Ireland in multiple sectors in order to export goods to around the world.
Yeah, I think, well, as you say, people often forget how young he was, 26 when he died, that he was kind of learning as each day he was thrown into power, and he was getting used to the mechanisms of government and also fighting a civil war at the same time. Now, I was struck by when you read his contributions to the revolutionary doll. Now, it didn't meet very often, and then when you compare it to what he wrote in Path to Freedom, that you can see a process in when some of his Dáil speeches in 1920, where he's very optimistic, as he refers to Connolly, he refers to the need to reject monopolistic capitalism, but also he doesn't like the idea of state socialism, and he refers to the need to redistribute land. But you can kind of see as the process goes on, particularly during the truce and the negotiations, that he seems to become more pessimistic. I think at one stage he made a speech in which he said we might be better off without the Irish manufacturing class, because they were showing absolutely no interest in supporting the new state. So it would have been very interesting to see, had he survived, would he have pushed the new state into a more radical position. I remember reading the Cumann nGaedhael, the Fourth Party programme, the draft programme. It was far more radical than the actual government put in place, and the leadership, people like Cosgrave and Higgins and the others, they completely rejected it. So there was obviously a feeling within the membership that they did still want to pursue the ideas that Griffith and Collins did, but that they were completely set aside. And you get this kind of, you see pictures of Cosgrave with his evening dress and his bowler hat. He said he's kind of a caricature of the people that they were supposed to have displaced as the leadership of the country. Would you get that impression from, I know it's a kind of it sounds like a pejorative description of them, but they seem to have given up almost on whatever motivated them in the first instance.
Yeah, I would say it's ultimately a very hard counterfactual to know if Collins, if Griffith lived past 1922, would they have had the will to shape the elite that were there sort of into their container of how economics should operate. I think that there is evidence for this. I think my specific example of this rejection of foreign loans, which I think does go on to sort of reverberate and set a precedent, where the Irish really didn't, in terms of the government, go into any sort of foreign sovereign debt until really in a big way after World War II, where after being neutral, the Irish decide to get a piece of some of the Marshall aid that was going on. And this is the first time that, there's a big introduction of foreign debt into the Irish economy as far as the government is concerned. And additionally, it's denominated now in US dollar. So these are all things that are important, because it's like, if it's denominated in another currency, you don't control that. Prior, you had the link with the pound sterling, and that was problematic in and of itself. But what you end up seeing is that at least there was some precedent set there, and there was a clear action taken rather than just talk, that while there's little evidence to show what was perhaps the full debate that was going on if they had this conversation amongst themselves at the time, there's a very simple letter that Collins writes that basically explains that they're rejecting it, that it's going to be a no. But to open that up and explore that more, I think just shows that they had the appreciation that was conveyed within the letters of Boland and Connolly at that time, and that it was not so peculiar to hear those things that were written in the letter. For instance, things that were written in those letters were how American financial imperialism basically went into Latin America and the Caribbean at that period of time, and through financial shenanigans, very indirect, very insidious, they kind of straitjacketed those nations and then used that straitjacketing and sort of, you have to pay your debts and all of this rationale to go in with full force military occupations to basically structure the economy in order to pay foreign finance. And so I think this was well within the existing economic consciousness at the time, which Griffith was writing about. I would say very directly since about 1904, even though there's shadows of it within the period of like 1898 and forward. And so when you think about it that way, and you think about Griffith's main inspiration coming from Frederick List, and we go back to Frederick List and read his text, what we end up seeing is that there is a clear understanding of a realist approach to international economics and finance, and that similar to how the Nationalist always viewed the English and sort of the Anglosphere-led theories of politics and economics as something that is alien and something that is ultimately, in a way, like ironic and ultimately a lie. Frederick List also had this same experience because he was writing this book within the 1840s in his native Germany. And at that time, Germany was nowhere near the conceptualized nature of it, which would be in sort of the turn of the 20th century, which was this emerging superpower that could challenge Britain on the world stage in World War I. At Frederick List's time, it was very fractionalized. It was almost considered a backwater. The industrialization did not take root really. And he viewed English ideas of economics that were being imported as essentially these devious lies that were made to hold foreign competitors back from England sitting on top of sort of the economic ladder of global, economic competition for imports and exports. And so when you bring that all the way back into what Griffith then expounded upon it, and then that what would fuel Boland and Connolly and Collins and everyone in between, you could definitely see that there is in no way that these ideas are sort of undeveloped or unarticulated or sort of without foundation to actually be applied. And so we ended up seeing that in Collins' Path to Freedom. We ended up seeing that in the policy action of rejecting the foreign loan at the close of the treaty. And then I think you can see also some examples of this legacy in some projects. For instance, the Shannon hydroelectric plant is one of my favorites to look at, because this was basically started from the backs of Griffith writing about the need for electrification of Ireland, Griffith talking about the natural resources like the water power of Ireland, him setting up in the first dial an industrial and resource study to go and investigate these matters. And then Collins actually articulating how important hydroelectric power will be. He goes on to sort of talk about British coal versus sort of black, their sort of importation and over-reliance on that. And then he comes over to talk about how hydro is sort of the Irish coal that they can tap into. And then this gets furthered in the 1920s, luckily. International panel is assembled from experts from Switzerland, Germany, and around the world to actually have a third party adjudicate if these ideas are just. And so they find out that it's actually a really good idea. Investment goes in. The Irish build this hydroelectric plant that at the time was probably one of the most advanced pieces of technology and also the biggest the world has ever seen in that realm. And it went on to supply 98% of the electricity demand for Ireland up until the 1950s. And so as I talk about that timeline, what you end up seeing is that the legacy of nationalist ideas of self-sufficiency, of focusing on domestic industrial work, is echoed and totally actualized within that example.
The hydroelectric scheme, that was a very good example. It stands out because it was exceptional. That there was none of the same desire to develop fisheries, for example. I can't remember, one of the nGaedhael ministers, where another nGaedhael TD brought up about investing into fisheries, and he said, look, nobody's interested in it. And that they just seemed to, the more the party was taken over by the old, big farmers and the financial interests, that they lost all interest in pursuing any kind of radicalism. I think it was 1926, they cut the income tax from 25% to 15%, and at the same time they cut the old age pension by 10%. There was only 60,000 people in the whole country, in the whole state, who were actually paying income tax. But as Sean Milroy, who was one of the nGaedhael TDs who left in 1925 to form Clonagh, he said, you people are obsessed with balancing the budget, and there's people literally living from hand to mouth. They don't have enough money, and you're cutting the old age pension in order to save income tax for people who never supported us in the first instance. It's a kind of a sad kind of epitaph on the whole revolution, that by that stage in the mid to late 20s, that the country was in depression. There was international factors behind that, but they just seem to have lost any sort of dynamism, I suppose, apart from Ardna Crush and the electric scheme.
Yes, and you mentioned Sean Milroy, and he was actually a close friend of Griffith. And during that 1920 period, he goes on to actually write essays blasting what the Conservatives were doing, and explicitly saying this is a deviation what Griffith wrote, and especially what Frederick List wrote. And so you can find exactly what he's pinpointing as the problem. As you talk about, there was the tax issue. There's also, why don't they have a central bank? Why don't they have an independent currency? Why aren't they guiding finance into independent Irish industrialization? All these questions were left unanswered, and the government commissions that were set up to explore tariffs and protectionism and currency and central banking issues all basically slid into the pre-existing economic thought that emanated from Britain. So it was totally baffling to people like Milroy and to people that were within that orbit of what was going on here. We started a new state to enable the national actualization of the country, and instead we're getting hammered on with these same policies and getting told that, oh, this is what independence was for. So that's a complete misjudgment that I think is, again, clouded as we look back generations later into that period, that there was a real deviation. And as Milroy talks about Frederick List and brings him up, I think he's so important to sort of emphasize, because often we're trapped between these two poles of English liberal economics and Marxian socialist economics. And while there are, certain truths that can be taken from each, it is really an injustice to kind of take the entirety of the discipline of economics and just foist it on those two, when Frederick List, as sort of a third way, had a different conceptualization that was not in this Marxian way that eventuated in sort of communist Russia and the sort of totalitarianist approaches of other countries, or the sort of individualized and oligarchic forms that often English liberalism can take. He always emphasized that nationalism was the forefront of how you design your economic system, and that the individual and the state have roles to play and they shouldn't be ignored. But ultimately, you unify these forces for the betterment of the whole. So I think that represents something that is distinct and something that does not in any way suggest that, oh, well, if there was any force towards state-directed economic planning, well, that has to be folded back into James Connolly's Marxist socialist ideas. Or if there's any sort of deviation away from that idea, as James Connolly criticized Griffith, and the rest of the socialists of the revolutionary period criticized Griffith as, sort of this capitalist wannabe. And that wasn't true either. It was talking about the unifying of classes, of different structures of the hierarchy, into the common good of helping everyone in the nation grow.
That's a very interesting point, because say Irish people they deal with the whole economic, the political war in terms of kind of classic left and right. There's either state socialism on the one hand or economic liberalism on the other hand. Never actually looked at what happened, say, some of the East Asian countries, where the completely different model. It was a mixture of the state-controlled currency, the state-controlled a lot of the financial institutions, but they didn't nationalise everything. They didn't nationalise all the small businesses, and it was a very successful mixture that's been very successful in South Korea, Taiwan, other countries. That nobody in this country seemed to be looking at this, and when they completely abandoned economic nationalism in the 1950s, instead of looking at those models which were starting to become successful, they decided to just open the entire economy up to multinationals. It could have, there seemed to be no kind of grounding in, as you say in your dissertation, and other people pointed out, a tradition of nationalist economics had long predated any of this, and that they just seem to have, in fairness, you get the impression from Sean Lamass and some of the other people in Fianna Fáil that they just, they'd gone through they'd gone through the 30s, 40s, early 50s, trying to persuade, cajole the people who controlled finance in the country to invest in industrial development, and they were not getting very far. So they just said, okay, if you're not going to do it, we're going to invite in, we're going to set up the Industrial Development Authority, and we're going to invite in multinational capital. So the Irish capitalist class just reverted to what they've always done, just as kind of a rentier class. Okay, we'll control the banks, we control the land, and if we need to, we'll set up hotels or whatever. Extremely unambitious ruling class that you could ever meet. But just going back to the earlier period that you were dealing with in your dissertation, looking through some of the Dáil papers and Dáil debates, you get the impression that while they had departments of finance and economics, that when they tried to set up structures, say like the Economic Council, I think somebody reported back saying, there's a lot of the trade unions, the Irish-based trade unions, they're interested in arbitration because they support Dáil Éireann, but the employing class, the farmer class, had no interest in what's in it at all. And the same when they tried to set up the land arbitration, that the people who owned the land had no interest. They only, I think, 15,000 acres by the time of the truce, and that when they set up the Sinn Féin Bank, that the only people who were depositing with the bank were either Irish Americans or Irish people who supported Dáil Éireann, who hadn't got that very much money, but were doing it as more of a gesture. That the people who actually had enough money to make a difference if it was invested in economic development wouldn't, they refused to cooperate with this. Do you think there was at any stage that Griffith and Collins, that kind of penny dropped with them, that they said, look, there's no point in appealing to the better nature of these people?
Yeah, so no one would ever say that there were not challenges in coordinating a variety of individuals within the economy with different interests and different upbringings, different ways that they view the world. And so I think the challenges were real. I think that you can find expressions of the feelings of futility to it all. But I would say that, again, the point of the nationalist system of political economy is to find the balance between, you could say, the Enlightenment capitalist ideal, which is moving away from sterile forms of aristocracy and moving towards this idea of meritocracy, where everyone can recognize that those who contribute productive labor, there's a degree of extra reward that they should get. And so you have the stratification and hierarchy within society, but balancing that with the idea that these people are within that hierarchy because they are advancing the general well-being of the nation. If they do anything to go against that, like invest abroad instead of investing domestically in a disproportionate fashion, then the state needs to come in to be the correcting force. So I think that the state as a correcting force was how Griffith and Collins viewed what they would eventually do. I think there's a funny example when I believe Collins was sort of getting the leaders of the banks together, and he was putting in sort of the conference room an economist from Cork, I believe, and there was some ruffling of the feathers because of that, because he wasn't, cut from the same cloth, and there was a little bit of an awkward scenario where Collins said something, and through his body language and his tone, basically communicated to those involved that he's the guy in charge, and he has a certain reputation for being an enforcer. So I think that whether or not that would have carried over into sort of the rest of policymaking, I think it's sort of, you can see these reflections on how the state was the final decision maker, not in sort of the communist way, like it was not planning, it was not designing in sort of a specific micromanaging sense. It was saying, this is the guideline, this is what you should do. We need to have industrial growth in Ireland. You need to invest in these sectors. We need to protect them from international, more competitive and advanced imports that are coming into the country. And so as long as you follow that model, the capitalists within the higher echelons of the hierarchy of society are enabled to do with their freedom as they will. So I think that became always a balancing act. And to return to the nationalized conception of economics, kind of best articulated with Frederick List, what that larger conversation is really about is actually exploring the economic development histories of every advanced country. And one of the points Frederick List makes is that England, as the sort of premier first industrialized power, got that way from all of these protectionist measures in terms of tariffs, in terms of restricting imports, in terms of making sure that they were picking sort of sectors that would be beneficial. And so he explores that history, that early history, and then goes on to talk about some other nations that at his time, 1841, when this book was published, sort of rose industrially. And he was really trying to make sense of this. He was also looking at early America and its development and how it was almost initially stymied by some of the same largely financial issues that were going on starting in Britain, because the British were actually investing in American economic development, and they were doing so in a way that would direct it towards stagnation and dependence on England. So this was an issue that was sort of always pre-existing of the insidiousness of finance and how this becomes a way to sort of indirectly conduct imperialism. And then as we explore just a little bit further, we can see that as America gets started in the second half of the 19th century, it explodes as sort of an industrial economic superpower. Germany, mostly through Bismarck, does the same thing. We actually see with the Meiji Revolution and thereafter with Japan, they do the same thing. And we can go on and on and on and list these examples. And we actually see that the premier industrialized powers that we think of when we really think of sort of this big boom in the 19th century, England, America, Japan, Germany, France even, they all emulate the ideas of nationalist economics. And it's only later that we get this veil that, English liberal economics is the way that you grow your economy, when really the almost only objective standard for how you do that is starting within nationalist economic policy.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because people forget that behind the facade of English liberalism, that they had all sorts of restrictions to basically exploit India, to stop the development of industry and agriculture in the United States, corn laws, even during the Civil War with the tariffs and trying to control the cotton trade. And of course, going back to the 1600s in this country, I don't know if you've ever come across a chap called Ray Crotty. I read his book in the early 1990s. I've been more inclined towards a Marxist view of economics, which had very little relevance to Irish history or to the development of the Irish economy. And his analysis of the way in which the whole Irish economy, the whole of Irish society had been shaped by the fact that Britain had insisted on keeping Ireland as basically the place where they got cheap food, live cattle, crops. And William Petty, it's an interesting statistic, it's kind of meaningless, but in the 1660, William Petty envisaged Ireland as having 6 million cattle and 300,000 people to look after them. In Ireland now, there are 8 million cattle and probably around 350,000 people involved in the cattle trade. So it's, and the proportion of the population of Ireland has gone from like 2 to 1, a ratio of 2 to 1 in the 1840s to, 10 or 11 to 1 now. It shows you how a key economic factor such as live cattle exports can shape an entire society.
Yes, exactly. I think when you go even further back in time and you explore the different episodes within Irish economic development and de-development, or I think Crotty uses the specific term undevelopment, what you see there is all of these same forces going on and sort of and again, when we talk about the state, when we talk about the nation, it often gets lost in sort of the communist baggage. But the sort of very objective standard of using the state and the nation sort of to protect the well-being of the people that live there, and thus, their economic interests. And what's interesting, even though Frederick List is this great author that explores this, and he's best basically known as you have Karl Marx, you have Adam Smith, and I believe Frederick List is within that pantheon of economic great men. Just as Griffith talks about in his work, that Frederick List is sharing a lot of ideas from Matthew and Henry Carey that were Irish Americans during the same period. What's interesting, if you actually go further into that footnote and you open that up, what you end up seeing is that Frederick List was getting at these ideas as a younger man in his 1820s while he was in Germany, but they weren't as structured. He wasn't as fully formed. He ends up getting exiled because he was agitating sort of in a liberal vein to sort of the existing monarchical structures of his Germany. And so he gets exiled. He goes to America to seek freedom. And he ends up in Philadelphia under the wing of the elder Matthew Carey and sort of the younger Henry that's growing as well. And ultimately, through his personal observations of America at the time and being directly within the influence of Matthew Carey, who's sort of a fixture in American politics at that time, you can actually see a lot of transference of knowledge and ideas to him that he gets in the 1820s, 1830s. And then by 1841, he writes this big book that becomes this touchstone of so many other nations. And so when we actually explore who was Matthew Carey, he was born in Ireland. He actually was an agitator within the leading up to the big sort of revolts and agitations that were going on up until the Act of Union. And so within sort of the 1770, 1780 period while he was still in Ireland, we can actually find journalistic endeavors that he did where he's expressing nationalist economics in all of these same attributes of tariffs, of protection. They talked about how England was hurting Ireland's already existing powerful industrial, at that time, what was considered industry, was sort of textiles and other things like that, that they were hurting because of their new policy programs. And there was a whole fight to actually protect the Irish economy from England.
Yes.
And so it's amazing that he ends up getting exiled, obviously. He goes to America to start his new life. And he ends up starting magazines that inform the American revolutionary cadre. And as we advance forward, if not Frederick List, the other prime example of nationalist economics in this industrial vein is Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States and sort of esteemed founding father. That his main documents that are sort of these touchstones of economic theory talk about the need for manufacturers within America, their self-sufficiency, how to incentivize that, how to maybe use tariffs and other protectionist measures. But what we actually see with Hamilton is that he's well within a readership of Matthew Carey's publication. And you actually see his assistant, he goes by the name of Cox, was actually a writer in the magazine. And people allude that Cox was really one sort of a primary inspiration and writer of the reports that Hamilton would eventually give. And so it's amazing that an Irishman born in Ireland that came to America is actually the fountain that's expressing all these ideas. And then to complete the whole circle, you talked about how Griffith was a fan of Davis. You kind of go back through the Young Ireland movement. You go into that sort of 1770s to 1790s movement. You go back further to even Jonathan Swift. You find that nationalist economics has a common thread stretching throughout the entirety of this modern Irish history.
That's very interesting, because I heard of Carey and be familiar with the Irish Parliament up to the Act of Union, and it obviously had a major influence on Griffith, even with the King's Lord and Common, his political model. And that was probably a crucial juncture, because even though the economic ruling class were descendants of the settlers, they were seriously setting about creating an industrial economy and processing Irish crops in the distilling industry, the flax industry in Ulster. And I think that's often dismissed. If you read, say, Connolly's Labour in Irish History, he's completely dismissive of all this. Oh, that didn't matter, they were only deluding people. That Connolly, for all his other merits, didn't seem to understand that aspect of economics, that actually that would have made a huge difference to the development of the country had the Act of Union not taken place. There would have been a more normal political and economic and social development, and we have avoided all the horrors of the 19th century, because you would have had a more stable and a more organic and better balanced economy. So even in that aspect, Griffith, by looking back to that, was kind of way ahead of his time, where most Irish nationalists wouldn't have been able to see beyond the fact that the people who controlled the Irish Parliament were all lords. They were all, descendants of the settler population. That, that's kind of, and the fact that you mentioned that somebody like Carey, he was only really able to express himself and develop his ideas when he left and went to America, like lots of other Irish people since, of course.
Yeah, I think it's very fascinating. This is actually a launching point that I'm hoping to write a future book about, is this whole entirety of Irish economic thought that I think is underappreciated in a big way, because we have the mainstream economic discipline fueled by writers from England, with maybe sprinkles of around the continent, and then you have obviously sort of the Marxist variant as the maybe second most popular, and then you have Frederick List as sort of, we get down the list and he's this third way, I think is great. And a lot of people focus on the German school of economics and his German contemporaries and how the German university system was constructing an alternative to so many English ideas. And which ultimately produced Marx himself and sort of a alternative variant. But I think it's very important, as much as the Germans have their due and the credit placed upon them. I think it's interesting that if Frederick List is our main adjudicator of it being German, I think it's entirely incumbent upon us to actually explore his tutelage by Matthew Carey. And then what was Matthew Carey talking about? And you end up seeing that through him, you can actually visualize the rest of Irish thinkers and how they viewed economics and see that there is something peculiar and particular about Ireland. And this is something that Ray Crotty also alludes at, it being sort of the first colony and also sort of, its distinction within the Western world and Western civilization, but also kind of stymied and all of this, that it has the first conversation and the first debate about these economic ideas, and they keep going forward. And so I would ultimately love to explore each one of these thinkers, starting within sort of the 17th century and going all the way through up to Griffith, to say that there was, just as we talk about the English school of economics, the German school, there is an Irish school. And if the Irish school might be ultimately the most important because it actually informs the German school, and then the German school is the authentic alternative to the English one.
So that's your next project, do you think?
Yes. Pending title, How the Irish Saved Economics.
It's just one example of often, Ray Crotty was a complete exception. I was in a Zoom with some Trinity academics recently, and they were talking about, they tried to foist this, colonial legacies. And there was two American academics, and they have obviously assumed that the conversation was going to be about the legacy of colonialism in Ireland, what happened to Ireland under colonialism, whereas the Irish academics, the whole point of the thing from their point of view was how Ireland had benefited from the slave trade in Africa. It's just a complete, do you guys not talk about what happened to your own country anymore? And one of them made the point that, yes, of course, there were people in Ireland who benefited from slavery and exploiting Africans who were brought to the Caribbean. But these were the same people who owned most of the land in Ireland and who were exploiting the Irish people because they'd been given the land through the various plantations.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. When I really became ingratiated into sort of the literature of economic history here, I was disappointed with how many scholars were there was this reflex within them to sort of reject Griffith, to reject any semblance of nationalist actualization in the economy. And it often inherited the same slanders that the British would use, in that there's something inherently deficient about the Irish people and their character. There's something deficient about the land and its size and its capacity for advanced economic activity, its resources. You go down the list and it's like there's always a slippery justification they can call on that that enables the Irish economy to remain unactualized. And I find that incredibly disappointing, because I don't believe that's the case. And these are the same people that value the diversity of thought and underlined. And they are entirely within an Anglo-centric worldview. And this is where I say, why are we not allowed to look at the progress of, let's say, South Korea as a nation that is roughly about the size of Ireland, roughly the same sort of resource potential, around the 1960s, when South Korea was at that time considered a peasant economy, it had about 10 million people. Ireland, at its height, I believe, had 8 million. After the famine, it declined a great bit and was declining further. And then today, it's about 5 million. So roughly about the same population sizes. And today, South Korea boasts a nation of about 50 to 60 million people. And they have one of the most advanced industrialized economies in the world, creating things like microchips, TVs, cars, they make things, they make value creation. So when I look at that outside the Anglosphere and to a nation that's actually a good parallel, that, and again, has the same sort of history of colonialism. I mean, Korea being colonized by Japan, being colonized by China. I mean, there is a very good parallel here. Yet they can do it, but the Irish can't. And that's what's baffling to me. And that's why I think that ultimately a lot of these scholars haven't seriously and critically dealt with the subject matter in sort of a global perspective, and instead remain very fixated on this Anglo-centric way of viewing Ireland, and ultimately how to justify the continued legacy of conservatism, and always not getting the full economic theory correct, which I view as the nationalist system of political economy. And instead, as we go through the rest of the 20th century into the 21st for Ireland, we have the resurrection of nationalist rhetoric with De Valera's Fianna Fáil. Ultimately, while some good things were done, I think it did not have this foundation in what Griffith was talking about. I think a lot of the leaders ended up kind of being inept or sort of corrupted by 1938. And then as you go forward, the actual protectionism kind of falters. And then by the time we get to the 50s, and this is something that Crotty can also expand upon, you get to sort of more of a Keynesian welfare state mode. By the time of the 60s, you get sort of this T.K. Whitaker opening up and liberalization. You also, with that, get the introduction of foreign debt-fueled economic growth. You have some industrialization, but ultimately explodes in a debt crisis come the 80s. And then by that time, Ireland's getting ready to be ingratiated in with the rest of Europe and switch their currency to the euro, which becomes fully realized in 1998. And then the Celtic Tiger and the boom and everything that comes from that, the tax haven status. And ultimately, we see it ends in austerity and the loss of sovereignty and the manipulation of not only the Irish economy today, but also the Irish political sphere.
Even if you go back to the 1930s, when they set up the second banking commission, wealth in South Korea might have had to do the same thing. The state didn't allow them to, the culture didn't allow them to, whereas here it seemed to be, if you could get away with it, then people thought you were, elected jettisoned in some instances.
Yeah, and I think it's important to examine that De Valera, his second act within coming to power within that sort of multi-decade period, because I feel whenever you try to resurrect these national ideas, people immediately go to that and say, oh, we tried that. De Valera came in, we tried economic nationalism, and that was attached to the gray period of frugal comfort and kind of the Catholic hierarchy really being oppressive within sort of the personal sphere of Irish culture. And so ultimately you have to deal with this and examine what it is. So when you actually look at it, what you actually find is, yes, there was rhetoric. Yes, there were attempts at doing some real self-sufficient industrial growth. But when you go closer, you see that, like the economic war, for instance, rhetorically, I'm sure a lot of nationalists have no problem with stiffing England on the bill for these land annuities. More power to them. I think, though, then how that gets conflated with the use of tariffs is something exactly that authentic economic nationalists like Griffith himself, I'm sure would have, if he lived, would have argued against. This is exactly like the vulgar economic nationalism that the liberals keep telling us is going to happen because you're reactionary. you are doing this in a way with no design. You're doing this in a way that you're not actually examining sector by sector and talking with the capitalists that are there and trying to organize the economy. You are merely just, resurrecting these tariff walls and England, reciprocating um, in a way that is totally blind. And so then ultimately, we have that be associated with how you actually implement tariffs, and whether or not it was disastrous or or merely just a net neutral is besides the point. And then as you go on, you talk about the Currency Commission of 38. There was the first one in 27. And so when you look at those two as setting the precedents for Irish monetary policy and everything that goes downstream from that, is that the 1927 one was actually led by Henry Parker Willis, who was an American economist that they brought over because they thought all the bells and whistles on him would be very attractive. And who is Henry Parker Willis? He was actually the main architect of the Federal Reserve System in America. And the Federal Reserve System has its own baggage and its own sort of ways of being. And what you end up seeing is that through his writing on that, he actually was against some of the political aims of restricting the financial sector in the benefit of the nation. And he was more of, how do we create more autonomy for the private bankers, to exhibit whatever they want to do. And then he actually goes on to create the National Bank of within the Philippines when the Americans sort of occupy that landmass and try to impose their policies there. And so you have Henry Parker Willis, who created sort of the disproportionately capitalist system of the Federal Reserve in America. He goes on to create a imperial monetary system within the Philippines. And now he comes to Ireland as like this genius to implement the new nationalist monetary system. And so like with this precedent, we see that there was already proof in the pudding that things were going to go the wrong direction and in the direction of the conservative Anglo-Irish banking establishment. And with that being said, you see then going forward that they reject the idea of a national central bank. They reject the idea of delinking from the British pound and controlling their monetary system. And they reject the idea of sort of guiding the banking system into quotas and sector mandates of domestic growth, which you can find all these regulations in place in places like Japan and Germany and America in their sort of exponential advancement when they were in their prime.
Every stage where there's a vital decision to be made, it's almost that the people who are in charge of the state are just looking for an excuse. It's no point in trying that. We'll just keep doing what we've been doing already. Even I remember, like, just over 20 years ago, and I was working in Leinster House, and it's time it was the gas fields, the Carlow gas field was coming on stream, and there was disputes over tax regimes and so on. And I were talking to Norwegians, and Norwegians were saying, it takes a lot of money, and they were talking about fisheries as well and tidal energy. It takes a lot of money to get these things up and going. But if you invest now, 20, 30 years down the line, you won't have to pay for electricity, you won't have to import electricity. And the invariable response from all across the political spectrum in Ireland was, oh, that's too much, you're talking about 3-4 billion. They spend that every year importing energy at a premium from outside the country. It's just no vision, no conception beyond what do we need to do to win the next election and stop the economy collapsing and stop the banks collapsing. And as long as that doesn't happen under one of their watches, they're happy. And that's just, it's a long way from what people like Griffith began with, unfortunately. Thank you very much. That was extremely interesting.
Yeah, if I could conclude on sort of the modern case for this is, I think with everything that we've seen with austerity coming after the financial crisis recently, the implications for political sovereignty, how much multinational companies through the tax haven policy direct the political sphere and manipulate the character of Irish nationalism. And going forward, as counterintuitively, the global system is itself taking away that one tax advantage of the Irish economic policymakers. Whether or not anyone appreciates the ideas that I'm putting forth, if that tax advantage is taken away from Ireland, you will have to deal with Irish industrial self-sufficiency at some point. You'll have to deal with how you make an economy work without this carrot of, low corporate tax. And so I hope that through the charity that you've given me to explain these ideas on your show and further articulations, people can kind of arrive at these ideas, see that they're very beneficial just from a purely objective standpoint, and also that they're totally conducive to the Irish Revolution, the national founding fathers. And if you have any appreciation for what those men fought and died for and what they really were striving for, you will then have to come to terms with that these were the economic ideas that they were striving for.